All right, so here's the other one that is, um, let's go factor folklore. All my life when I was young, you need to go ahead and kill that Spike because he ain't never gonna be nothing worth having. Fire away. Is that true?
False. No, no. So there are a lot of factors that can impact that yearling set of antlers, right? And some of the work that I actually did when I was in grad school looked at how litter size, so whether that fawn was born with another fawn in a twin set or a singleton or whatever that might be, and timing of birth actually impacted yearling antler size more than a lot of other factors, right? So you have this spike. It could be a spike for several different factors. But it doesn't mean that's always going to be a spike or even a small deer for that matter of fact. There is compensation that occurs once you get to 3, 4, 5 years of age. Now, when you start talking about how big that spike is at 1.5 years of age, there's a little bit more to it on that route. But no, once a spike is not always a spike.
Okay. Have y'all done any research or had any information on like a deer that was a spike and then it blew up into like just a massively big buck or something like that?
We have several examples of that, yeah, where you have spikes. And there's like Luke said before, each buck is an individual, right? And we start talking about movements, it's the same thing for antler growth. We oftentimes talk about managing a population or averages. So oftentimes we're talking about on average, spikes will do this or whatever it may be, right? There are certainly individual examples of tiny spikes that are blown up to 140, 150-inch bucks at maturity. Sure, but that's not like we've talked about before. That's not the norm. Certainly.
Okay. So what
Um,
about, go ahead. Go ahead.
so one thing I would like to add to this is when you think about um, spikes in a population, spikes are kind of a catch-all term for little doinky yearlings, and with very few exceptions, a spike is going to be a yearling buck. Now, an exception could be if there's a 2 or 3 year old and he has pedicle injuries or whatever, and he's just got strange antler characteristics that would not be there otherwise. But by and large, if you see a spike, he's going to be a yearling. So the certainly the once a spike, always a spike isn't an accurate statement because once a yearling, not always a yearling, right? As long as you allow them to get old, they're not going to be a yearling the next year.
Right.
Number two, and I think this is a really important consideration, is not all spikes are created equal. You can have a spike with 2 inch spikes, or you can have a spike with 6 or 8 inch spikes. And when we look at any age class, but let's just take yearlings for this case, any age class in terms of antler characteristics, we're going to have a bell shaped curve of antler characteristics. We're going to have a small percentage of individuals way on the far left of that bell shaped curve that are way below average for their age class. So they might have 1 inch or 2 inch spikes. And then we've got the main chunk of that bell curve, and most of those are going to be, maybe, and this is going to be highly regional, region dependent. It's going to be dependent on lots of different factors. But, we could say on average, in that kind of the main chunk of that bell curve, we're going to have a lot of spikes that are maybe 4 to 5 inches. And then on the right side of that curve are our largest antlered yearlings. We might have 6 or 8 inch spikes over there, or we could have multi point yearlings. So they could be 2 points or 3 points or even 6 points. And those are our really kind of superstar yearlings. Now, when you and we've there's very good data to back this up from multiple research projects. When you track those individuals through maturity, even the spikes are fairly predictive of mature antler characteristics. So let's take the smallest third of yearling bucks. So they've got, 2 inch spikes. And then we've got the middle third. Maybe they've got 4 or 5 inch spikes. And then the right third. So they might have 8 inch spikes or they've got, 3 or 4 point frames. When you follow those three groups through maturity, there are always exceptions here, always exceptions. But when you follow those individuals through maturity, they kind of end up at the same point in that curve as a 5-year-old as they were as a yearling, right? So the smallest yearlings tend to be the smallest 5-year-olds, and the largest yearlings tend to be the largest 5-year-olds. So a spike that's 6 inches, that could be a really good yearling, because that's not the same antler development as a 2-inch spike, right? So a 6-inch spike might end up being a 140, whereas a 2-inch spike might end up being a 118 at maturity. So not only is the once a spike always a spike thing certainly not true, but I would also throw in there that not all spikes are created equal.
So you would definitely say, and I think I already know the answer to this, but like every now and then, in the area that I'm in, and I'm in Louisiana, and so much like Mississippi, but we have big buck contests and stuff like this at local stores, and like every so often somebody will come in with like just a freakish 14-inch spike or something. That's just an exception to the rule. What you saying? That's a not a yearling, but a freak. Is that?
I, I would say more than likely that's either a real freak yearling, or it's probably, I would not be surprised at all if that's like a 3-year-old with a pedicle injury and
Yeah.
he's just got
Yeah.
some weird thing going on.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it definitely don't look normal. That's for sure.
Yeah.
When you see it step out and you're like, holy cow. But I know around here the average person is like, oh, that's an old deer. He ain't never gonna be nothing. I'm shooting that sucker, and boom, just letting him have it. So we'll never know what he is at 5.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
and you say that, and that brings up another really important point. When you're talking about deer management, you have to be pulling jawbones and aging those animals,
yeah,
because otherwise you don't know. And if you're not collecting harvest data that's age specific, it's very hard to interpret.
sure, sure.